One of the things that Fromm talks about at the end of this first section on the theory of love is, how to put it, it's kind of a psychological or psychoanalytic symbolic understanding of what love is trying to accomplish. The kind of idea that he is presenting here is one that I think he lifted from the psychology of Carl Jung, who in his work discusses the psychological necessity of synthesizing disparate elements within our psyches in order to achieve actualization and fulfillment. The general idea being, look, there are parts of you that you are suppressing, that you don't want to look at, that you are holding down. If you want to become your idealized self, all you can be, you need to merge with those parts of you. So, in Jungian psychoanalysis, this is known as shadow work. You confront those parts of you that you have been repressing, holding down, avoiding, ignoring, your shadow, and you try to integrate it with your conscious awareness and your conscious understanding. Fromm takes this in a slightly different direction, in a more general direction. Instead of just talking about the shadow, these repressive elements of our psyche that we should integrate ourselves with, he talks about love generally and how love is motivated by the desire to unite what he calls the masculine and the feminine. So what we're doing when we're practicing love, when we're engaging in love, is we're trying to perform some kind of union of disparate or opposite elements or phenomena. Regardless of whether or not we follow Fromm instead of some of these other psychoanalysts and analyzers of mythology and symbolism in the idea that there are parts of the universe that are masculine and parts that are feminine, we can recognize that the symbolism still holds. And this is something that is this general idea of disparate elements being synthesized together is something that we see a lot in Eastern philosophy and religion. We might liken this kind of symbolism, the union of disparate elements, to what is going on with the symbol of yin and yang. I know it's a terrible drawing, but I know you get the picture. In Eastern philosophy and religion, the idea is that basically all of what you see around you is one interconnected system. It's one thing. But that one thing has a bunch of multifaceted and different manifestations. So you are a different manifestation of the oneness of the universe than the table is. Or the projector is a different manifestation of the oneness of the universe than the poster is. Generally, the idea is this one interlocking, interdependent system is constituted by, informed by, influenced by the interplay of these different elements, these different sides of things, these different properties. The same thing Fromm thinks is going on with love. And he breaks it down in a bunch of different domains. He talks about love from the sexual angle, the biological angle, physiological, psychological, and spiritual angles. And he talks about how love in all these different domains involves trying to produce this kind of union between what we symbolically take to be masculine and feminine. Sexually, this is obvious, right? Reproduction proceeds only by, at least historically, the sexual union between the two sexes, right? Male and female. So sexually, the sexes seek to unite with one another in some sexual way, right? Physiologically, this idea of disparate elements or processes can be observed in the fact that all humans have the different sexual hormones within them to varying degrees, right? Testosterone and estrogen. What it means for us to operate properly is to have the proper physiological balance of these hormones in some sense, right? To achieve some sort of balanced synthesis of these things. Psychologically speaking, and I think Fromm is again lifting this from Jung and Freud and other psychoanalysts, humans have masculine and feminine dispositions, ways of thinking, ways of conceiving and interpreting the world. We might criticize these traits or dispositions or whatever as being heteronormative, but we don't need to interrogate whether or not they're wrong or right here. We just need to recognize that the way that we've symbolically and mythologically come to understand the world around us fits the general mold that he's describing. Whether or not that's good or bad is something we can debate about. For better or for worse, we have likened various psychological dispositions and attitudes to femininity and masculinity. Right? Psychologically, what is masculine? Bluntness, directedness, taking the lead, right? Adventure, this kind of stuff. You might say aggression. And what are some things that are likened to the feminine aspect, psychologically speaking? I don't know, care, agreeableness, trying to comfort, emotional intuitiveness, right? These are things that we liken to masculinity and femininity, and ways that people live and think and act. Spiritually, there's also this bipolar mold going on. Insofar as psychologically speaking, we have a masculine and a feminine part to us, or aspects to us. In Jungian psychoanalysis, this would be the anima and the animus. So if you're a female, you have like a masculine kind of spirit within inside you that you need to integrate, known as your animus. If you're a male, you have a feminine spirit within you that you also need to integrate, known as your anima. Spiritually, humans are also a synthesis of these different elements of matter and spirit. Mythologically speaking, matter has been associated with femininity and spirit has been associated with masculinity. What we are as things in this universe are some sort of synthesis of matter and spirit, of physical stuff and mental stuff. Thus, what Fromm is trying to draw out here is basically, he's trying to show that in all of these different domains of human life, how we physiologically work, spiritually work, psychologically work, physically and sexually work, there are these two sides or two disparate elements or forces that are at play, that are producing the kind of unified thing that you see in front of you, that you are experiencing, that you're living through. This basic polarity between what you might call the masculine and the feminine, or the yin and the yang, the high and the low, the hot and the cold, the inside and the outside, all of these existing in relation to one another, interdependent, cannot exist without each other. This polarity is the basis for all creativity, he says, both sexual and otherwise. And what he means by that is, well, in order to explain this, he brings out a biological view and a more general view of how nature works. The human species has survived only through the meeting, biologically, of sperm and egg, producing a zygote, right? We also see this polarity in how natural processes work. He talks about this on pages 34 and 35. The same polarity of the male and female principle exists in nature. Not only, as is obvious, in animals and plants, right? You have female animals and male animals, and also plants that have what you might call male parts and female parts that they use to reproduce, right? But in the polarity of the two fundamental functions, that of receiving and that of penetrating. It is the polarity of the earth and rain, of the river and the ocean, of night and day, of darkness and light, of matter and spirit. This idea is beautifully expressed by the great Muslim poet and mystic Rumi. Never, in sooth, does the lover seek without being sought by his beloved. When the lightning of love has shot into this heart, know that there is love in that heart. When love of God waxes in thy heart, beyond any doubt God hath love for thee. No sound of clapping comes from one hand without the other hand. Divine wisdom is destiny and decree, made us lovers of one another. Because of that foreordainment, every part of the world is paired with its mate. In the view of the wise, heaven is man and earth woman. Earth fosters what heaven lets fall. When earth lacks heat, heaven sends it. When she has lost her freshness and moisture, heaven restores it. Heaven goes on his rounds like a husband foraging for the wife's sake. And earth is busy with housewiferys. She attends to births and suckling that which she bears. Regard earth and heaven as endowed with intelligence, since they do the work of intelligent beings. Unless these twain taste pleasure from one another, why are they creeping together like sweethearts? Without the earth, how should flower and tree blossom? What then would heaven's water and heat produce? As God put desire in man and woman to the end that the world should be preserved by their union, so hath he implanted in every part of existence the desire for another part. Day and night are enemies outwardly, yet both serve one purpose, each in love with the other for the sake of perfecting their mutual work. Without night, the nature of man would receive no income, so there would be nothing for day to spend. Thus, what he's trying to bring to our awareness is ontologically and psychologically, we see that the universe operates according to this basic polarity. You don't need to interpret it necessarily as masculine and feminine. You could interpret it in a different way. You could interpret it as the right side and the left side, or the upside and the downside, whatever you want to call it. The general idea is that we tend to interpret the world in this way, right? We tend to interpret phenomena as being manifestations of something, of a spectrum between two extremes. We think of things as hot and cold and in between, as heavy and light and in between, as high and low and in between. Heaven cannot exist without earth. Infinite cannot exist without finite. So, it seems like the universe operates according to this weird polarity, which again is emphasized in Eastern thought. And it also seems like our perceptual mechanisms see the world through this lens. We perceive and interpret the world according to such a polarity. Human character is like this too, and this is what he ends this section with. Humans are masculine and feminine in how they behave. That is, they are rational, penetrative, guiding, active, disciplined, and adventurous, as well as receptive, protective, realistic, enduring, and motherly. Everybody operates in both of these ways to different degrees depending on the kind of person that you are. So, within the human person, within the human psyche, and within nature, the general point he's trying to make is that there is this polarity. A strange thing to bring up, to discuss. It sounds kind of mystical and woo-woo, right? But it has direct connections to the field of psychoanalysis that he is drawing upon and the mythological ways that humans interpret the world around them and act within that world. What he moves on to next is a description of the different kinds of loves that we engage in. This is what he talks about in sections 2 and 3. In section 2, he talks about a specific kind of relationship, a specific kind of love, that between parent and child. And then in section 3, which we're going to look at a part of today, he talks about other loves that we humans feel and engage in, and what their proper and improper forms look like. So let's start first with love between parent and child, like he does. What he provides in this section is kind of an analysis of what humans are like at the beginning stages of their life, and what kind of relationship is constituted by that. At first, And this is something that we actually saw in Avicenna, right? Humans are narcissistically self-centered. Isn't this how babies act and think? Are babies worried at all about the needs or desires of other people? No, how do they behave? Right? Then if you don't give them what they want, right? Yeah. He's like, look, we come into this world being utterly dependent on our mother at first, right? Literally, without her, we would not have been birthed. We would not have been formed. But then, after we are born, we can't fend for ourselves. And we're narcissistically self-centered. Okay, we're thinking only about our own feelings and our own desires. I mean, really, we're not thinking that much at all. We're mostly responding to stimuli and reacting to our environment. But our focus is inward, right? It's directed towards self. Thus, the way that we interpret the world around us when we are babies, this is how all babies think and act, is they do so only through their own needs and their own experiences. Make sure I'm spelling this right. What babies do is they demand from those around them. Right? They demand food, they demand to be changed, they demand milk or formula or whatever it is. They demand comfort and security. They do not have the capacities to understand their own situation or direct their active energies outwards towards others for their own benefit. Right? Babies are just concerned about meeting their own needs, and they're very good at telling us that when their needs are not being met. Right? Fromm notes that at these beginning stages of human biological and psychological development, the baby has no capacity or means to differentiate itself from its mother or whoever its caretaker is. Oftentimes, it's going to be a woman. At least historically, that has always been the case. So, when the baby is in the womb, and for a while after the baby is born, it kind of equates itself with its mother and its caretaker. It's not really thinking about this, right, consciously or directly, but it has not yet been able to differentiate itself from other, at least not from its own mother. Over time, as the child develops, it starts to gain certain capacities and abilities and begins to see the world in a different light. Generally, the first experience of love that a child receives is from its mother, and the experience of being loved, is crystallized usually through the mother's actions, such as holding the baby, breastfeeding, feeding it, etc. So, for many babies, the first experiences of being loved that they receive is from their birth mother. It is only as the child grows and develops physically and psychologically that they begin to have experiences of love with other human beings, that they begin to interpret and see the world in a different way. At first, they lack the ability to differentiate themselves from their mom. And you might say, like, a baby just born doesn't really have the ability to differentiate itself from anything. At least not consciously, right? It's not thinking, oh yeah, I'm different than this guy that's holding me, right? For all we know, the only thing it's experiencing is, bright light, fuck, like, because babies nowadays are born in these giant, white, bright rooms. So at first they lack the ability to differentiate. Insofar as a child lacks this ability, they have some sort of security and peace, right? Because they are not separate from the source of the love that they are receiving. And they don't see themselves as separate from the universe, right? Recall that for Fromm, the situation that we're trying to get out of, that affects us all, is this feeling of separateness from the universe around us, right? We feel separate and alienated from it. That's why we do drugs or drink or distract ourselves or seek relationships, is because we're trying to close that distance, eliminate the existential dread that we feel due to that separateness. Well, before the baby learns how to differentiate itself from others, it is existing in that oneness. It is not existing within any separateness. It has no conception of separateness. Consequently, as it grows and as it gains this ability to differentiate, it starts to see the world in a different way, to have new experiences, to come to see itself differently eventually as it gets older. At first, the baby is utterly dependent on those around it in order to survive. Right? Out of the womb, none of us could have cared for ourselves. Right? We were utterly dependent on our parent or parents. We can't hunt, we can't gather, we can't even lift our own damn heads. Right? We need somebody to feed and clothe us and keep us warm, or else we would have died. So in the beginning, we are dependent on a bunch of things around us for our own survival. But as we have experiences with the world, as we grow physically and psychologically, we slowly gain independence from our parents, from our families, from our friends, right? We start to be able to do more for ourselves. This independence comes with positive and negative consequences, right? What can you do with your independence? You get to enact your own free will, right? You get to do whatever the hell you want. You get to pursue your own desires, pursue your own goals, make up your own mind about things, right? You're free. You're freer than you were before. The problem is that with this freedom comes the inevitable feeling of separateness. Because insofar as you are free, you recognize that you are free from that which is around you. You are not equivalent to your mom anymore. You're not the same person. Your dad is different than you. Your friends are different than you. Oh my goodness, the plants and the animals, they're different from you too. Now all of a sudden there is this distance between you and everything else, right? As you are starting to come into your own. At first, we are focused purely on receiving love because that is all that we can do. And that is what our capacities limit us to, right? All the baby can do is receive love that the mother or the father or whomever gives it to them. The baby can't, do acts of service for their parents. They can't hold space for their parents who want to vent, right? They can't cook for their parents. No, right? At first, all children can do is receive love. But as they grow and develop, they gain the ability to give love to others, to give love to those around them. And so the focus shifts from receiving love to giving love. It is in these general ways that humans develop in relation to love. This kind of development is only made possible due to there being a certain kind of relationship between parent and offspring. And by parent, I don't necessarily mean your biological parents, but the people who raise you, and who looked out for you. Historically, and this is still a lot of people's experience, children receive two different kinds of love. And in turn, they learn two different kinds of love from their parents. What Fromm calls motherly love and fatherly love. And we learn them from other sources too, right? Media and education and schooling and all these different things. At this point in his analysis, there are at least two different archetypal kinds of love. These two kinds of love are different. They are manifested in different ways. They have differing effects on people. Depending on the kind of motherly and fatherly love that we receive as children, that's obviously going to have a huge impact on our psychological development, right? And on our attachment style, and on the kinds of insecurities that we might have, the kind of confidence and personality that we have, the kinds of traumas that we have and hang-ups that we take into relationships, right? So the experiences that we have as children are going to end up greatly impacting the kinds of things that we do in life and the kinds of ways that we see the world and interact with others. Symbolically speaking, Fromm likens motherly love to what he calls nature, soil, ocean, and home. This kind of love is connected to the child. It is unconditional. It is outside of the child's control, and it provides security to the child. And there are reasons why he says this, which I'll explain here in a second. Why he likens the love of the mother to this natural phenomena. think back on what he had to say about the polarity of the universe. Think about how human beings are made, how they are grown, and how they come into the world. Think about the different symbolic and mythological associations that we give to natural phenomena. In the Western world, God is likened or associated with masculinity, right? In nature, Gaia, Mother Earth, is likened to femininity. For the first however many months, a fetus is growing inside of a female. That is literally its home, right? And it's associated with water. It's aqueous in there, right? So literally that's where the child is living for a while it grows. And then, eventually it leaves that place. But the association that's formed is one of security, is one of hominess. This is why he likens it to natural phenomena like the nature of the soil or the ocean. Not only because of the real biological elements of what's going on in the womb, but also because of our mythological associations of how we talk about masculinity and femininity throughout the ages, of the different gods and goddesses that we have discussed, and the myths that we have come up with in order to explain the world around us. This kind of love is unconditional. The love that a mother gives to her offspring, Fromm says, is not because of anything the child does. The mother just loves the child because it is her child. This is going to differ from fatherly love when we talk about that here in a minute. This kind of love is outside of the child's control, at least during these beginning stages of development, right? The mother either shows love to the child or she doesn't. The child can't do anything to make her love it, right? It is either going to receive that love or it's not. And this kind of love provides physical and emotional security, right? Think about the times when you were a kid where you hurt yourself or you wanted comfort and you ran into your mother's arms, right? Insofar as the majority of people are basically raised by their moms, generally, and perhaps more specifically in these beginning stages, a very different association is formed between your mom and your dad. If this love is proper, it allows the child to grow, to gain independence, to eventually foster the child's capacities and knowledge so that they can someday fully separate from the mother. In other words, Fromm is basically saying if motherly love is carried out properly, its ultimate aim is the releasing of the child out into the world and into their own way of life and thinking, instead of smothering them and mothering them their whole life, right? But obviously we know that this isn't always what happens, right? There are mothers who do not wish to let their child go, right? Who do not want their children to grow up. Motherly love improperly exercised can be smothering and limiting, or it can be cold, according to Fromm. That is, you can have like a helicopter mom who's constantly worried about you and checking on you and not leaving you alone and smothering you. Or maybe you have a mom that is detached and checked out from your life. I know somebody like this, unfortunately. Y'all have seen this, right? In movies, TV shows, perhaps experienced it in your own life. Unsurprisingly, taking care of a human being for a long time, you're going to form a pretty strong connection with it, right? So it's not surprising that a lot of moms would not be ready and willing to let their child go. They want to continue to shelter them from the dangers of the outside world, to protect them. When that is leaned into too heavily, you end up getting sheltered children, right, who don't understand the way the world works, and they're made worse off when they do eventually enter the real world because they're not prepared for it. Similar negative consequences can happen if fatherly love is not exercised properly. What kind of love is this? If motherly love is associated with nature, soil, ocean, home, Fromm categorizes fatherly love as the world of thought, of man-made things, of law and order. We might say fatherly love is artificial as opposed to natural. Which is not to say that it's any less important or less effective, but it's of a different kind, he thinks. At first, he says that fatherly love is not really connected to the child. Because historically, it wasn't fathers who really raised children and took care of them and held them and changed them and did all these things. But they were out, making sure that the tribe survived. Hunting and gathering and holding the stuff together as best as they could outside of the home. Protecting it from invaders and so on. So, normally what ends up happening is motherly love is the first love that the child experiences. It's only later that the father, historically, has become more involved in the raising of the child and in the picture, if that makes sense. I want to make sure y'all can read this. And this is a common trope, right, that you see in a lot of movies and TV shows. And insofar as there are only some things a woman can do for her child, such as breastfeeding, perhaps this isn't so surprising, right? I don't think I can breastfeed. Maybe I don't know, but you get the point, right? And males cannot give birth. In any case, he says that at first this kind of love is not a significant part of the child's life. Maybe we would want it to be so, though. Maybe we'd want this to change. Insofar as motherly love is outside of the child's control, it is either imposed on the child or not, They either receive the love or they don't. Most do, right? Most mothers love their child and just dump their love on them. Fatherly love is within the child's control to cultivate, says Fromm. There are things that you can do to generally make your dad love you more or less. And that is what is kind of scary about this love, right? If the mother's love is unconditional, maybe it sucks that sometimes she smothers you, but a whole other anxiety or worry is present when you realize that if only I could make my dad proud of me, then he would love me, and I could make him proud of me somehow, but I just can't fucking do it. And that causes me a lot of pain and suffering, right? So insofar as, according to Fromm, this kind of love is somewhat under your control to cultivate, there's pressure on you in order to do that, right? Because you have some sort of psychological need to be loved by both your parents, right? Not just by your mom. So there are pros and cons to this love being within your control to cultivate. Insofar as it's within your control, there's hope for you. But that also means you have to do stuff in order to get that love, right? This manifests in a bunch of different ways depending on who the father is. Some fathers really want to push their sons into being athletic, sporty guys, right? And if you're not an athletic, sporty guy, your dad's not going to be proud of you, Or whatever it is. It doesn't necessarily have to be sports. It can be other things. This kind of love, in contrast to motherly love, which provides security to the child, it provides guidance on how the child is supposed to think and live. You can see this in action when you think about who stereotypically disciplines children. In our movies and media, right, it's like the dad's got to come up and say, listen, kid, you're really fucked up. But that's all right? It's about you getting back up, right? So providing guidance on how the child is supposed to think and live. Doesn't provide security, right? Oftentimes, you're not going to go cry to your dad, generally, about how you tore up your knee, because he would say, buck up. It's just a little scrape, right? So stereotypically, this is kind of how this works out and the kinds of different impacts it has on children. Obviously, this is going to be different from parent to parent, from person to person. You're going to find some fathers that exhibit more motherly love than fatherly love, and some mothers that exhibit more fatherly love than motherly love. It all depends on the person. But obviously, as we saw with the motherly love, this kind of love can be exercised properly or improperly. What do you think this kind of love does for a child if it's utilized and exercised properly?
Makes them strong and independent.
That's right. It makes them strong. It instills principles and expectations. You might say it produces competence, right? If I could write, that would be great. It makes the child more competent, more confident, and it teaches them that eventually, they can rest assured in their own powers, abilities, and their authority eventually as a person coming into into adulthood themselves. In other words, Fromm says that this kind of love, when exercised properly, basically helps the child. It prepares them for the trials and tribulations of life, for the chaos that is out there. It makes them ready to face that. What if this is done improperly? What kind of effect can that have on a child?
Could make them like mean or angry or something.
Yeah. Yeah, how? Why?
If they're not like provided a good example on the fatherly side, it could tend to skew their perspective on how it's supposed to be.
Right. Yeah, again, just basically take a pick of any of your favorite movies, right? Think about the tyrannical or authoritarian hard father that rules their household with an iron fist, right?
Like Scar.
Yeah. Yeah, not
dad, but it's close enough.
Yeah, not a real nice guy,
No,
right?
he got murdered.
What kind of, if a child grows up in that kind of situation, what is that going to produce in them? Well, probably some traumas. Resentment, yeah. Maybe they're going to become cold and hard themselves, right? Because they need to become cold and hard to deal with what the father is doing to them, right? They need to steel themselves, lock up their emotions, not express them. If this is not exercised properly, the kind of behavior that you might see is threatening and authoritarian, right? Or what? If your dad's around and he's not loving you, if he's not exhibiting fatherly love properly, he might be tyrannical. Or what?
Unconnected.
He might be absent. Right? Might just check out entirely, leave to go get milk and never come back. Right? So obviously it's critical for children to experience the proper forms of these loves. And again, these loves are not unique only to, men and women, males and females. Okay? People exhibit both of these kinds of love in their own ways, to different degrees. Because again, everybody, Fromm is going to say, have masculine and feminine elements in them and a part of them. So you exhibit motherly love and fatherly love in your own way. And if you have kids, you will do so as a parent. If you're a guy, that doesn't just mean you exhibit fatherly love. Maybe that is the kind of love that you tend to exhibit most often. Maybe, but it depends on the kind of guy that you are. Right? In any case, what he tries to impress upon us in this section is the importance for these relationships on a child's development, and how it is incumbent upon parents to love in a proper and virtuous way. Failing to do so is going to cause their child problems. And look, none of us are going to be perfect parents, but we can try our best. Yeah. What maturation involves as the child develops and gets older is it involves internalizing and exercising both of these kinds of love in the proper way, with the proper balance towards other human beings. So what we're doing when we're maturing is we're learning to understand and exercise these loves, these kinds of love to other people, in the appropriate and timely ways. Sometimes your friends require motherly love. Sometimes they require fatherly love. Maturing as a person involves learning how to do that well, learning when to lean into one or the other, who to do it with, all that stuff. If there's an overabundance of one kind of way of thinking and loving within you, that is going to cause problems for your relationship, your relationships. If, as the child develops, it doesn't internalize both of these loves appropriately, then they will experience neurosis. They are not able to synthesize these competing psychological forces and elements within them, and that will produce complexes. If the child doesn't receive these loves in their proper amounts, degrees, types, in the proper situations, all that stuff, they'll experience trauma. And then they'll likely go on to act out traumatically on others, right? And engage in harmful behaviors towards themselves. And he talks about this on pages 43 through 46, which I'll read here in a second. It looks like it says otter. There we go. Maybe that's better. Fromm says on page 43, halfway down the page, the mother's and the father's attitudes toward the child correspond to the child's own needs. The infant needs mother's unconditional love and care physiologically as well as psychically. The child after 6 begins to need the father's love, his authority, and guidance. Mother has the function of making him secure in life. Father has the function of teaching him, guiding him to cope with those problems with which the particular society that he has been born into confronts him. In the ideal case, mother's love does not try to prevent the child from growing up, does not try to put a premium on helplessness. Mother should have faith in life, hence not be over-anxious, and thus not infect the child with her anxiety. Part of her life should be the wish that the child become independent and eventually separate from her. Father's love should be guided by principles and expectations. It should be patient and tolerant, rather than threatening and authoritarian. It should give the growing child an increasing sense of competence and eventually permit him to become his own authority and to dispense with that of the father. Eventually, the mature person has come to the point where he is his own mother and his own father. He has, as it were, a motherly and a fatherly conscience. Motherly conscience says, there is no misdeed, no crime which could deprive you of my love, of my wish for your life and happiness. Fatherly conscience says, you did wrong. You cannot avoid accepting certain consequences of your wrongdoing, and most of all, you must change your ways if I am to like you. The mature person has become free from the outside mother and father figures, and has built them up inside. In contrast to Freud's concept of the superego, however, he has built them inside not by incorporating mother and father, but by building a motherly conscience on his own capacity for love, and a fatherly conscience on his reason and judgment. Furthermore, the mature person loves with both the motherly and fatherly conscience, in spite of the fact that they seem to contradict each other. If he would only retain his fatherly conscience, he would become harsh and inhuman. If he would only retain his motherly conscience, he would be apt to lose judgment and to hinder himself and others in their development. In this development, from mother-centered to father-centered attachment, and their eventual synthesis, lies the basis for mental health and the achievement of maturity. In the failure of this development lies the basic cause for neurosis. While it is beyond the scope of this book to develop this trend of thought more fully, some brief remarks may serve to clarify this statement. One cause for neurotic development can lie in the fact that a boy has a loving but overindulgent or domineering mother, and a weak and uninterested father. In this case, he may remain fixed at an early mother attachment, and develop into a person who is dependent on mother, feels helpless, has the strivings characteristic of the receptive person, that is, to receive, to be protected, to be taken care of, and who has a lack of fatherly qualities, discipline, independence, and ability to master life by himself. He may try to find mothers in everybody, sometimes in women and sometimes in men in a position of power and authority. If, on the other hand, the mother is cold, unresponsive, and domineering, he may either transfer the need for motherly protection to his father and subsequent father figures, in which case the end result is similar to the former case, or he will develop into a one-sidedly father-oriented person, completely given to principles of law, order, and authority, and lacking in the ability to expect or receive unconditional love. This development is further intensified if the father is authoritarian and at the same time strongly attached to the son. What is characteristic of all these neurotic developments is the fact that one principle, the motherly or the fatherly, fails to develop, or, and this is the case in the more severe neurotic developments, that the roles of mother and father become confused both with regard to persons outside and with regard to these roles within the person. Further examination may show that certain types of neurosis, like obsessional neurosis, develop more on the basis of a one-sided father attachment, while others, like hysteria, alcoholism, inability to assert oneself and to cope with life realistically, and depressions, result from mother-centeredness. So, he's claiming here that the basis of psychological health and maturation lies in balancing these forces, in building up within yourself appropriately both a motherly and a fatherly way of seeing and acting within the world. Finally, let me just go over one last thing. That is where he ends section 2. Very psychological, psychoanalytic analysis, right? Section 3 is where we finally get into an exploration of some of the stuff that we've already looked at a little bit. The different kinds of love, or what he calls objects of love. The different things that we can direct our love towards, and therefore the differing kinds of love that we can embody and exercise towards self and other. He starts off this section, though, by again recapitulating what love is. Because this is something that we need to continually remind ourselves. Is love a feeling? Maybe that's part of it, right? Is that all of it?
No.
What does Fromm say love is? How did we define it in our notes? Yeah.
Love is an art.
It's an art. Yes. And what else?
Something that needs practice and skill and work.
It needs practice and skill. I think he says at one point that it's an expression of what is alive in you. Right? It's an expression of your powers, of your aliveness. It's not just a feeling, but it's an activity. Right? Not just a receiving, but a giving. Yeah?
Did he say it was the motivating force behind love?
He says it's the answer that we have come up with to overcome the separateness and existential anxiety that we feel. So kinda. Yeah. He provides for us again his definition so that we don't get it twisted. What does he say? Love is an attitude or an orientation of character which determines the relatedness of a person to the world as a whole. So it's an attitude, orientation, activity of the spirit, a faculty, you might call it. It's not just something that you feel or something you receive, it's something that you do. And it structures how you orient yourself with respect to the world. And in some sense, how you see the world, right? And furthermore, it's an art. It's something that we need to practice, that we need to get good at. So that's love. It's obvious that there are different kinds of love. Right? We can use this faculty, this power of the Spirit in different ways. What are some of the kinds of love that we've already looked at in class? Think of all those Greek words that we looked at. Eros, yeah, what was that?
Isn't it like just the purest, like natural form of love?
Some people think that, yeah. Yeah, it's like, well, we get our word erotic from it,
Yeah.
right? And what is erotic love?
It's passionate or, yeah, it's just passionate or erotic.
Yeah, passionate, longing, desire to become one with someone in some sense.
Then we talked about philia.
Right, what was philia?
That's a brotherly love or a friendship.
Right, brotherly love, exactly. And then anything else?
Yeah.
What else did we look at?
There was like the familial love, like a mother
Right. Right.
Storge,
Yeah. And what was that?
that's family love. And then agape, which is the charity for universal love.
Right, right. That was the big one for C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
Right. The kind of love that we are. You can either think of us as channeling it, like it comes from God and we're channeling it. Or maybe we're like a mirror and we're like, "Bzoo, God's love at you, right? I'm the best mirror." Well, Fromm talks about some of these in this section. Namely, he talks about brotherly love, the motherly and fatherly love that we already discussed, and erotic love. And like some of the other authors that we looked at, he characterizes these loves in the same, if not very similar, ways. These different kinds of love that we can exercise, engage in, they're dependent on what we're directing our love at and how we're using this power. So are we directing it at humanity? Are we directing it at a single person? Are we directing it at our brother? Are we directing it at our lover? Are we directing it at our offspring? These are some of the things that determine the kind of love that we exercise, the forms of love that we embody. We can talk first about brotherly love. What is this? What kind of love do you think this is? If you think about philia.
Like friendship.
Yeah, and like, who do we have brotherly love for?
Our friends.
For sure. Anybody else?
Your teammates, maybe.
Yeah, maybe your teammates. I don't know, maybe your coworkers. For Fromm, he characterizes like brotherly love as like, it's the love that you feel for humanity, man. You know, like, he calls it the most fundamental kind of love, which underlies all other loves. It's inclusive. It sees other people as equals. It does not really admit of the differences or eccentricities, right? It's almost as if when we are engaged in brotherly love, I see you as a human being like I am, right? And I love you for that. And I see you as like equal to me in some sense, right? There's this notion of equality. When we exercise this kind of love, differences dissolve away. And if proper, it's directed out towards other people. It's like an equalizing form of love that ideally we direct towards all human beings that are out there in the world, you know. Directed. There we go. Fundamentally, it's love poured outward, right? We can also talk about motherly love. I know we just got over kind of the effects that this has on the child and what it's supposed to look like, but we can describe it here again according to the same schema that we did for brotherly love. According to Fromm, motherly love is unconditional affirmation of child and its needs. Whereas in brotherly love, it is directed out at other people that you perceive as equals to yourself, and it is equalizing in this respect. In motherly love, ideally, one becomes two. It is not directed towards someone or people that you see as equal to yourself. It is unequal. And it's not directed towards equals. It's directed towards what you conceive of as, who you conceive of as kind of helpless. Right? Somebody who needs help.
Is it helpless or is it what you covet?
It would be love directed towards someone who needs help, in other words. So helpless. But obviously it's not love between equals, right? Love between a mother and her offspring is not like love between you and your friend. Right? There's a different kind of power relationship, different kind of situation there. So he calls it unequal. You might say it's something higher, with more knowledge, with more capacities, helping something lower, someone lower. The baby or the child, right? Who doesn't have the knowledge, the capacities, the wisdom to provide for themselves. But even if we don't understand this in a strict parent-child relationship, we can characterize motherly love as directed towards someone who requires assistance. So you can exhibit motherly love to people out there in the world. You don't have to be their actual moms, right? If this love is properly exercised, what it instills in a person is love of life generally. Not fear and anxiety about the universe. And Fromm discusses this on page 52. This goes into his discussion of erotic love because he's comparing all of these loves together and contrasting them. Brotherly love is love among equals. Motherly love is love for the helpless. Different as they are from each other, they have in common that they are by their very nature not restricted to one person. If I love my brother, I love all my brothers. If I love my child, I love all my children. Hopefully. No, beyond that, I love all children, all that are in need of my help. In contrast to both types of love is erotic love. It is the craving for complete fusion, for union with one other person. It is by its very nature exclusive and not universal. It is also perhaps the most deceptive form of love there is. So, in contrast to these, we have erotic love, which is not love exactly for the helpless or love for all of humanity. It's some kind of craving for complete fusion with another. It's not inclusive of everybody. You don't feel erotic love to everybody. Your erotic love is exclusive. It's not universal. You don't feel erotic love to all of mankind. You feel it towards like usually one person at a time, right? So it's exclusive and not universal. It is easily confused with sexual desire. Erotic love is often, he says, confused with the explosive experience of falling in love, the sudden collapse of the barriers which existed until that moment between two strangers. But as was pointed out before, this experience of sudden intimacy is by its very nature short-lived. After the stranger has become an intimately known person, there are no more barriers to be overcome. There is no more sudden closeness to be achieved. The loved person becomes as well known as oneself, or perhaps I should say, as little known. If there were more depth in the experience of the other person, if one could experience the infiniteness of his personality, the other person would never be so familiar, and the miracle of overcoming the barriers might occur every day anew. But for most people, for their own person as well as others, is soon explored and soon exhausted. For them, intimacy is established primarily through sexual contact, since they experience the separateness of the other person primarily as physical separateness. Physical union means overcoming separateness. And then he speaks of how it is that lovers in erotic relationships end up acting towards one another, how they seek to reduce the distance and separateness between them, and that how oftentimes people confuse erotic love with just a desire for sexual union, sexual experience. Whereas erotic love is something deeper and more profound than that. Erotic love, he says near the end, if it is love, has one premise: that I love from the essence of my being and experience the other person in the essence of his or her being. In essence, all human beings are identical. We are all part of one. We are one. This being so, it should not make any difference whom we love. Love should be essentially an act of will, of decision to commit my life completely to that of one other person. This is indeed the rationale behind the insolubility of marriage, as it is behind the many forms of traditional marriage, in which two partners never choose each other, but are chosen for each other, and yet are expected to love each other. In contemporary Western culture, this idea appears altogether false. Love is supposed to be the outcome of a spontaneous emotional reaction, of suddenly being gripped by an irresistible feeling. In this view, one sees only the peculiarities of the two individuals involved, and not the fact that all men are part of Adam and all women are part of Eve. One neglects to see an important factor in erotic love, that of will. To love somebody, he says, is not just a strong feeling. It is a decision, a judgment. It is a promise. If love were only a feeling, there would be no basis for the promise to love each other forever. A feeling comes and it may go. How can I judge that it will stay forever when my act does not involve judgment and decision? Thus, erotic love involves completely individual attraction, often unique between two specific persons, But at the same time, erotic love seems to be nothing but an act of will. Both of these seem true, or as it may be put more aptly, the truth is neither this nor that. Hence, the idea of a relationship which can be easily dissolved if one is not successful with it is as erroneous as the idea that under no circumstances must the relationship be dissolved. So this form of love, which we feel very strongly, is highly exclusive, personally felt, individualistic. But the proper form is not one that is just overcome and driven by pure feeling or whim. It is an act of the will, a decision, a promise, a commitment. So, think about that over the next 2 days as you reflect on the rest of what Fromm has to say, and as we finish up this section on the other kinds of love. Because there are more kinds than just these three. Next time, for example, we're going to look at self-love and what that involves. Okay, does anybody have any questions, concerns?
No.
All right, cool. Well, thank you very much for coming. I hope you found this interesting.
Absolutely.
It's certainly different, right?